Hi, everybody. I'm Dennis Daly. I spent 20 years with United Press International, most of it with the old UPI Radio Network. And my favorite assignment was going on the road producing and hosting American Montage. It was an hour-long weekly program. Now here's an edited version of one of those shows. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's American Montage, the sound of a helicopter flying into a field. We are south of the city of Seattle, Washington, very near one of the Boeing facilities, standing on the parking lot of what is called the Museum of Flight. It is confused by many people as a Boeing museum. It's not. It's a museum that pays homage to the grand traditions of aircraft, going all the way back from the days of gliders to the modern-day space program and even the Boeing 777. As you know, I love to fly, and I had for a long time wanted to come to this museum. In a moment, a very knowledgeable fellow named Jim Mellon will be showing us through. Seattle is crisp and gorgeous this time of year when it is not raining, but don't believe the publicity. It doesn't rain here all the time. Behind me is a beautiful 707, painted in blue and white with a U.S. flag on the tail. It says United States of America. It was one of the 3 707s delivered to the White House in the Eisenhower years that served as Air Force One. There are other aircraft out here in the parking lot area, mostly military, but inside a grand display of the history of aviation. Our guide to the Museum of Flight is one of the docents, one of the volunteers, a former Air Force pilot himself, now retired, Jim Mellon.
A lot of people that come into this museum think that they're in a Boeing museum. We have tours that have agendas showing visits to the Boeing Museum, and it's probably one of the things that I'd like to clarify in our conversation. First of all, it's not a Boeing museum, right?
It is technically called the Museum of Flight.
It was the Museum of Flight, and one of the most frequently asked questions that I get here, next to where are the restrooms, is what is that Douglas DC-3, and that's the big blue and white job hanging there in the gallery, doing in a Boeing museum? Now, that's a good question. Good question.
Can we walk over that way and maybe start the tour? This is somewhat reminiscent, in my mind, on a smaller scale, to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, which is probably one of the most visited of the Smithsonian buildings, if not the most, where you have the aircraft suspended from the ceiling. This is a beautiful plane. As you say, it's blue and white. It has 2 engines, one on each wing. It's a propeller plane. From what era is this?
Well, this aircraft was designed and built in 1935 by the Douglas Aircraft Company. So this aircraft has been around a long time. During the war, there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 of these aircraft manufactured, and they flew for the Air Force under the name of the C-47, and they were more lovingly called the Goonie Birds.
Now, is this then essentially what we in civilian life would know as a DC-3?
Absolutely, this is a DC-3. So again, back to my question is, what is a DC-3 doing in a Boeing museum? And the answer to that is simple, that it's not a Boeing museum. It's a private, non-profit foundation, and it's funded by memberships, by donations and contributions, and the Boeing Company is perhaps the largest and most generous contributor to the museum, and indeed we're very proud to have this association with them. Now, it's a simple matter when we get back to the mistaken identity. We're on Boeing Field, we're in the middle of a Boeing industrial complex, and we have the Red Barn, and that's that building right next door to us. That's the first building that the Boeing Company used to manufacture aircraft in. So why not think it's a Boeing museum?
Absolutely. Now, there's a plane down here on the floor, which is, you look at planes from this area, it's a biplane, two wing surfaces, yes, with the diagonal, are they struts or wires? I'm not sure what.
They're both. They're struts and wires.
Struts and wires to hold the wings apart. Mm-hmm. And outboarded are 2, one on each wing, engines with visible cylinder areas, or what do they call the radial engine?
They're radial engines.
In a circle, positioned in various angles around it, and then one in the middle. Am I wrong? Is this a Ford trimotor?
No.
It's not. It's somebody's trimotor.
It was built during a time when the Ford trimotor was in its prime. The trimotor, of course, was an all-metal, cantilever-winged, trimotored monoplane, single wing. Now, you would wonder why this aircraft was built as you said, with struts, wires, and two wings.
It seems to be a kind of a transition aircraft.
It seems to be. But there was a decided reason for that, and that was to allow the aircraft to operate in and out of airfields at higher elevations in the Rocky Mountain areas.
Two wings, more lift?
More lift, exactly. Landing slow, taking off at slow speeds in short fields. The design of the aircraft was accommodate the mail on the route from Chicago to San Francisco. This was the trunk line that was being flown in those days. Boeing built the aircraft recognizing where it would be flying, and designed it in a manner that would suitably do the job.
Is it safe to say that in the era before the really practical all-metal plane, and I'm thinking here of the DC-3, to carry passengers economically came into being, that there was a great reliance on that subsidy for carrying the mail?
Well, absolutely. First of all, carrying the mail was the first real commercial use of aviation. The pilots of the smaller aircraft that met this trunk line aircraft on the feeder lines would encounter a businessman or a person who had to be in Detroit from Cleveland or missed the train, and they would offer the pilot a few dollars if they could, get this now, ride with the mail in the compartment with the mail. The pilots would accept this. First, before you know that, the owners became aware of this potential and requested that the designers and manufacturers of the aircraft build a compartment suitable for a couple of passengers. Got that? A couple of passengers.
Extras, if you will.
Extras, right. So the first aircraft that came out to accommodate passengers was what they called a Boeing Model 40, and it was a biplane, and it had a little compartment in front of the mail compartment for two passengers. Now, when Boeing put this aircraft together, he built this to accommodate 12 passengers. He also included in this aircraft a lavatory, and he had stewardesses on board. He was the first person to include the services of a lady in the roles of a stewardess.
So even though I tended to think of the DC-3 as really the beginning of the passenger age, this is a fairly large fuselage on here for the era.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But it couldn't have had a lift without two wings. Likely not.
It could have had the lift, but it couldn't have negotiated the high-altitude fields, the short fields for takeoff and landing. That's the key. That's what Boeing was looking for, the ability to get into places like Cheyenne, Wyoming at 7,000 feet elevation. All right? And other little tiny fields. Remember, we're talking about the 20s, the late 20s, and the 2-mile stretches of concrete that we're accustomed to using in our 747s and so on were non-existent. They were grass fields, and normally they were fields that were shared by cows when they weren't used by aircraft.
We walk to another part of the sprawling museum, and there hanging from the ceiling is one of the most startling-looking planes ever built. The Blackbird, they call it, that high-speed reconnaissance plane. But the model there had an extra added attraction on top, a small little drone, if you will, and Jim Mellon tells me that was one of the early models that, well, never really panned out in its development.
The beginning of the system was called the A-12, and this came out on the drawing boards in I would say 1959 or 1960, right about that time. And it came about as a result of inadequacy of the U-2. Now, you remember the U-2?
The old Francis Gary Powers incident?
Yes. Gary Powers incident, that's right. The government recognized that the U-2 was reaching its limits. In other words, technology was reaching the point that it could get to the U-2. I honestly have to say that flying was my only love. It was the only thing I ever really wanted to do, and I have achieved that. And this is a wonderful place to be. It's the only museum that I know of. If you get tired of looking at the inanimate objects inside, you can come outside and watch new 777s land.
Thanks a lot.
I appreciate it. Thank you for asking me.
And there you have it, another edited episode of one of the American Montage programs prepared for the UPI Radio Network back in the 1980s and 90s. I'm Dennis Daly. Thanks for listening. Thanks for going with me this week. And check YouTube for more American Montage programs.